All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It's 1:30. I'd like to declare the meeting open and welcome everybody present. First item off the list is, do we have any apologies today? And if not, any early departures? No, great. Then let's move on to agenda item 2. So declarations of interest. I call for any if there are. If none, then agenda item 3. Under agenda item 3, I just wanted to advise that if no one wishes to speak to the publicly excluded minutes of the previous meeting, then I'll bring the confirmation forward to the public session. So does anybody have anything that they wish to discuss in the public excluded minutes? Okay, if not, then I will bring them forward to agenda item 3.2. So referring to 3.1, the public minutes, are there any comments or amendments on those?
No, that was very adoption.
Excellent, thank you very much. So Councillor Hopkins mover, do we have a seconder? Excellent, so I put the motion to the meeting. All in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Okay, so now we'll move on to agenda item 4. Agenda item 4 has 2 decision reports that we're going to go through today. The first being the risk management policy and the second being the insurance renewal. So the report's been circulated and I'll ask Paul to introduce it.
I'll literally just pass across to the risk advisor. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is a new risk management policy, which has been tabled for recommendation for approval by council. There previously existed a draft risk policy at some point, but nothing has formally been adopted by council. So this will be the first of its kind. The policy comprises 4 main elements. So we're looking at operational risk, project risk, key risks, and that includes operational, strategic and financial risks in that key risk category. And we're also looking at operational risk events within this policy as well. The policy is aligned to the ISO risk management standard and follows risk management best practice as well. I'm happy to take any questions on the content of the policy, but other than that, I think that's it from me.
Sorry, Councillor Harley.
Thank you, through the chair. Just on page 4, my apologies, I should have asked that question this morning in the workshop. I'm just in regards to our committee receiving all the risk information. I assume there will be a framework for us to be able to assess and monitor and evaluate the risks that will be coming to us to assess.
So there'll be some risk training which will happen in the new year for elected members. So you'll be able to understand how to interpret the information that's provided. But there's not necessarily a framework as such for interpreting what's provided, but it should align to the policy. So we'll provide you with the impact and likelihood tables for the risk types that are being looked at. So you'll be able to see how the ratings have come about and what that actually means.
Thank you. As long as we have a systematic way of being able to evaluate, review and how effective it is.
Thank you. I guess that segues into a couple of questions that I had, Amelia. One, I just wanted to point out that the role of the Performance Audit and Risk Committee, so that's on page 20 of our report, is primarily to be informed, and I just wanted to make sure that all of the representatives on the Performance Audit and Risk Committee were comfortable that being informed was their key role. And secondly, I had some questions, and this is perhaps just a bugbear of mine from previous lives, but I had some questions around the project risk management, and I just wanted to call that to the members' attention. So on page 26, So my understanding is that projects will run and continue to be run as they always are, and that the project risks will be highlighted to the project risks will be reviewed by the ELT, and the ELT may decide to report any such risks to PAR for noting. I thought that was a little flexible for my liking. And I just wanted other people to maybe share their thoughts on that, and also the fact that it would only come up quarterly. It would be my expectation that if there were significant project risks identified, they would come up at the very next PAR. Sorry, Councillor Harley.
Thank you. I'm just following on from the role in terms of the Performance Audit and Risk Committee as being informed of risks and where they sit. But in terms of governance, our role is actually to evaluate and monitor and review. Being able to undertake that kind of function is a core part of our role. So I'm just wondering, is there scope within that to be able to do that role? If we're just going to be informed, then we're not fully undertaking our role as governors. So that was just a question that I wanted to pose.
Yes, so I think that's a valid question. The RACI table itself is more about what happens within the framework in terms of documenting and managing the risks. So the responsibility, I guess, would not sit with yourselves to manage the risks that are faced. The responsibility would be to ensure that those are being managed appropriately. So I guess that's kind of where that table was trying to lead to. But I'm happy to take that on board and kind of change the wording if you'd prefer it to be informed / governance.
I guess, especially for those higher risks, I think workshopping them with the PAR is quite important. So absolutely, we would expect the ELT and the team to do the initial groundwork on the risks. But I think, to Councillor Halali's point, the inherent and the residual risks for those high risks need to be presented to the PAR for us to be able to contribute to before they're locked down. I think the group collectively needs to be given the opportunity to say that we don't think that the treatment is enough and that more could be done, or we think that it's not as serious a risk as was originally identified, given that we're ultimately on the hook for it.
Yeah, absolutely. The risks themselves won't ever necessarily be locked down. They'll always be sort of movable. So if there was an opinion of how we should approach the controls for a risk, or whether, you know, this forum believes that actually the risk rating is incorrect, then we would always go away and review that. But yeah, I think ultimately we do need that from this forum, the feedback that you're going to provide, and we will take that on board when it's appropriate and when it's possible to take further action. I guess there's, to go to your point on the project risks about how those will be fed up, the feeling there was that things with projects obviously can move very quickly. So if something is of high risk this week, and we know that next week there's action to be taken that will actually reduce that significantly, it would be for ELT to say, actually, we don't need to raise that to PAR at this moment in time. So it's that kind of filter that we felt was required before we provide certain project risks, which we know can move at a rapid pace, to this forum, when actually the situation may have changed by the time the reporting is completed.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. Maybe we just want to think a little bit about the wording in there. Sorry, before I go on, do any of the other members have any questions? Councillor Hopkins?
Well, yeah, there's a question. I could make it a comment, or I'll ask it as a question. Reading this, it did strike me that there's an awful lot of, there is some of this that is not policy. It's explanation about the basis on which the policy is being derived. And I'm wondering if you would accept that we could perhaps simplify and reduce the content of this document so that some of the expository material is included as an appendix, but the policy itself is simpler and shorter. Because it seems to me that the policy is, we have a low risk, we have a low appetite for risk. Here are the risks, and here's more or less what we think we're going to do with them, and that's our policy. Oh, and by the way, it may change from time to time as we identify new risks. And if you want to know how we work this out, here's the appendix to explain it. Would that, do you think that might benefit, if not us, then the public who might read it?
Mr. Hyde?
I think you'll acknowledge the point, Councillor Hopkins, but I think you'd be very optimistic if you believe more than one or two members of the public might read this document. I mean, it's almost an unusual space. It's, yeah, as we talk about, it's almost a management document and a policy combined into one. You do accept that. I think that's because it needs to be a working document, and the matters you've the chair and deputy mayor have raised, are, well, where is that line? But I think that the key is, as an organisation and as a collective, we need to more actively manage this, be more aware of it, and having it all at one document. I think developing that collective understanding of council's risk appetite. It's good to have it all in one document to say, well, here's the bits you work through to actually develop that understanding.
I'm probably just indulging my passion for Hemingway rather than sort of Faulkner, but I mean, but I take the point you're making, and it probably is not worth the effort to unpack it. But I don't think it needed to have been as long and complicated as it is.
I think to call it long is probably an exaggeration. It's only sort of 10 minutes.
It is long.
Yeah, I think to Mr. Hope's point and to yours, if we were to look to significantly reduce the volume of it, I don't know how much we'd gain from it, but Mayor Kircher.
Yeah, I just want to touch on a couple of things and just ask some questions on them. There's mention of this applying to community board members, but is it also talks about providing appropriate training and everything. Is it really aimed at community board members, and will they be given that training as part of their whatever happens with them? Because I'm not sure how much focus on risk they have.
That's very useful feedback, and I think it's probably it was trying to be inclusive, and may have just gone a wee bit far with that measure. And I think I would agree that there's probably not going to be a lot of risk reporting or a consideration of risks other than at a very low project level by the community board. So I think that's an amendment we could make.
If I could just add to that, Mr. Chair, throughout this, there's references to elected members and so on, and I think and increasingly, I think my preference is that there's reference to the governance team, and that would also then include, in this case, Mr. Neil, who's for this purpose is part of the governance team, rather than just elected members. And there's a reference in there that for the purposes of this policy, an employee is defined as all elected members and appointed members. I think it's just sending the wrong message. We are not employees, and and this is a really good reason why it has to be a reference in that way. I'd rather it wasn't, but happy to have any feedback on that. It's just we need to be reminded every now and then around the difference between governance and management and staff. Labelling us as staff isn't a good way to make that clear.
Thank you. Any further comments on Mayor Kircher's points?
Well, I have a question: will the policy be changed? I mean, what Gary's saying is that there should be distinct categories rather than a generic category that includes everyone.
So we'll take that away and we'll work through it and come back with any amended changes that are suggested.
Yeah, I mean, the purpose of this report is essentially make amendments and then for the final version of the policy to council for adoption. So this isn't an adopted meeting, this is feedback and adjustment. Thank you.
So in that case, look, the one thing that I wonder if we need to explore a bit, and maybe we don't tease it out now, perhaps it does come through the Treasury policy rather than risk. But I do believe that we're going to, and this may well be spill over into the area of transformation. There is an increasing risk related to borrowing, obviously the interest charges. But alongside there is the risk/opportunity of investing. And we don't have any policy at all about investments other than the most conservative and most cautious. And I'm wondering whether, in the circumstances we now find ourselves, whether it might be prudent to give some thought to that, but whether it's here through risk or through Mr. Wells and the Treasury policy, I don't know.
Yeah, so look, my advice would be that we absolutely separate those two. And that this is more around operational risk and project risk, but you're absolutely right. There needs to be a treasury management policy, which there is through, and we develop and evolve that through Bancorp. And I think that financial risk management is absolutely a separate policy that needs to be treated independently of this. Are there any other questions from any of the members? Okay, so on that basis, the recommendation is that the Performance Audit and Risk Committee adopt the policy as it is, given the changes that we're looking to make. I suspect that we won't do that today.
No, it's recommending to council.
Recommending to council for the adoption of the risk management policy, sorry.
Chair, I'm happy to move that with the following change, that the Performance Audit and Risk Committee recommends that council adopts the risk management policy with amendments as agreed, attached as Appendix 1 to this report.
Excellent. So thank you for that. Do we have a seconder?
No.
Excellent. So we have a seconder. So on that basis, if there are no more, I'd like to put the motion to the meeting. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you, Amelia. That brings us on to the next agenda item now, which is item 4.2, insurance renewal. So again, Mr. Hope, would you like to introduce the report?
Thank you. Ms. McIntosh will talk about this one mostly, but this is an item that we really did want to bring to council to highlight not only the coverage but the cost. This is one of the cost pressures we are facing. So very keen to get your feedback on a couple of key issues, but also to help your understanding of the range and scope of the insurance arrangements we have, and whether there is a desire by council to do further investigation into some of these items in terms of whether coverage is appropriate and further investigation of items that may be able to reduce cost. So sorry, Mandy, I've now spoken too much, but over to you.
Sorry, thank you for that, Mr. Hope. Yes, as Mr. Hope has pointed out, it is just to bring forward to you situation with insurances globally is that the premiums are continuing to rise across most insurance premiums, and that's a result of significant increases of claims and a significant cost of recoveries. And those claims are generally from weather events that are increasingly significant across the world. And whilst that impacts us is because our insurance premiums are generally placed from Singapore and wider markets, UK and Singapore markets that we put our premiums through, our policies through. So what happens around the world impacts us here in New Zealand, and it impacts our premium base. The last time that we actually did a major review of our premiums was back after the earthquake, Canterbury earthquakes. And at that stage, with the premiums soared across New Zealand. And at that time, we made a decision to reduce our material damage schedule for any assets that were over the value of $750,000 only. After a few years, those premiums started to recover and they started to drop again. But over the last probably five years, we've seen an increase again on those premiums, and they are continuing to rise significantly. And we're now at the level where we are now right across our portfolio. Along with material damage increases in premiums, the other significant area of increase is the public liability and public indemnity premiums. And that's been a really interesting arrangement there where over the probably 10 years ago, or not quite 10 years ago, about 8 years ago, we had a cover on each of those premiums for $500 million cover per event. And it's now down to $15 million per event. And that's where we have an umbrella insurance that gives access to another $150 million should an event arise, that sits there in a pool that we pay money for to have an access to extra funding. Because as you heard earlier, today, a situation with a leaky building can be very expensive, and it's having those pools of access there. We are fairly lucky here in Waitaki. A $15 million cover is still quite a reasonable sum. But if you're another council that's got big issues and public liability claims, 15 million can be absorbed very quickly. And that is all that the insurance market will offer with that umbrella there. So what we wanted you to have a look at and consider is essentially if you're comfortable where the premiums sit, bearing in mind that in 2024, we will have a change to the level of premiums with the changes to Three Waters ownership. That will make a significant change to our material damage schedule if that goes ahead. And also noting that we do have now, with the rising premiums, we've now got 24 community halls that are insured under our schedule. And they do that because of the rising costs as well. So we recover those premiums on those buildings as well as for any commercial leases that we have out there as well. So what we're paying, we do recover about $130,000 a year from those leases. But it was just giving you the opportunity to say, are you comfortable with the portfolio, and are you comfortable with the schedule? There are some proposals there that I've put forward on a couple of assets that I think we could consider whether we continue to cover at the same level, being the airport side assets and the public toilets and 1 Tomb Street, or whether we want to make a change there to do some savings. So yeah.
Thank you. So we're looking at about 170,000 increase in premiums between the two, so about a 20% lift in our costs for a very similar level of cover.
That's correct. And where that's largely come from this year is we had to do every 3 years we have to do the revaluations on our buildings. And so that's added $35 million on our material damage schedule without actually changing any of those buildings at all. And that's a significant increase there. And the other key area for the increase in the premiums this year is the public indemnity policy as well has taken, professional indemnity, has taken a $40,000 increase there. And we are also still waiting on the final figure for what that umbrella cover will be. We don't have that yet.
Right. So it's the revaluations of things like the Opera House
Correct.
that lead to a significant increase in.
Yeah, and that's why I've identified sort of what our top 7, when I say the most expensive 7 assets are on that list there, just so you can understand that there's a big amount of that just within those top 7 assets and where those values were previously to this current valuation as well.
Thank you. I'll now open it up to the floor if anybody has any questions on what's been presented here. Councillor McCone.
Sorry, there's a mixture there of full replacement and indemnity, depending on what those assets are. For example, we have the Opera House, and a lot of the key buildings that we use that are council owned are replacement. Some of them, like the RSA, which is that's only indemnity right now. So it's looking at the current use, as well as with the halls, it's their choice whether we insure at indemnity or full replacement. So with the Wataki Community Centre, Recreation Centre, I should say, that's full replacement as well, but it's up to the individual premises what they want to ensure in that regard. Commercial lease is generally for full replacement, because that's a requirement under those terms of lease.
Thank you. And zooming in, we have a question from Councillor Percival.
Yeah, Mandy, I'm just there's quite a few things I'd like to ask, but just this one at the moment. The 7 most expensive assets you've mentioned on page 40, there's a 40 grand increase in premiums on that. Have we considered increasing our risk as far as excess on those buildings and assessing the risk factor on those? Or because I've just had a personal review of all our insurances, and we've changed quite a few things by increasing in some areas excess and reducing in others, and thereby carrying more risk, but are calculated in the fact that surely we could be doing the same here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Percival. Yes, and that's one of our recommendations there with regard to 110 Street, is reducing that excess there to, increasing that excess there to a $50,000 excess. We currently have that particular building at a 5,000 because of the leases along there. So we'd just change the excess on the main building at 110 and leave the rentals at the 5,000. But it is an option. Most of our key buildings are at a $50,000 excess, which is quite high, but quite standard. We recently put in the paper, we did have the community flats that were in Palmerston that suffered a fire event earlier this year. They had previously been at a $5,000 excess, but we changed that about 18 months ago to a $50,000 excess on that particular property. And where appropriate, we do look at whether we can change those excesses. What we've done with the toilets, for example, as well, they're at a $5,000 excess, but we'd like to minimise the cover on those because the low value claims that we've had through on those products has not justified the work in putting a claim in on a lot of any of the small community dwellings or the toilets. We're generally getting claims for about $6,500, but you'll spend so much time preparing those claims as you would if it was a $50,000 claim. So we have been looking at those excesses to try and see if there's an opportunity to change those. And that's where I think when you look at your commercial leases, we have an agreement there that we have to have a minimum of the excess is $2,000 as per the tenancy agreement. But it's an option there to look at whether we increase that and we're willing to carry that risk as well, exactly as you're suggesting on some of those buildings.
Although you do say early on in the report, Mandy, that there's minimal savings associated with changing excesses of those commercial leases and halls to 50K.
And that's correct. It's minimal.
Do we have an inkling of if we increase the Opera House to 100K, what impact would that have on the premium?
I'd need to talk to our insurers about increasing that beyond the 50K to 100K. But generally, when you look at, say, for example, changing 110, the savings on that property would be about $5,000. It's not significant, but if you do it over more buildings, it adds up. But you've got to remember as well that's related to the value of that building that you're changing. So if it was only a $500,000 building, you're going to have less saving as well. So, but I'm happy to do some work and have it, and you know, if there's some buildings there, I can happy drill into that later and do some workings on, say, a dozen buildings to review.
Thank you. Councillor Percival.
Yeah, I inadvertently didn't take my hand down, but I'll still ask a question. Yeah, Mandy, do we have a minimum amount for insuring assets? Like if we have an asset that's only worth 60, 70 grand, and if we lost it, we wouldn't even look at considering replacing it. Do we have a criteria for not insuring and taking the total risk of some of our assets, as in perhaps an old pump shed out in Tokaraki, or I shouldn't say that, John, but you know, some obscure building that we've actually still got on our insurance cover?
Yeah, so we don't have all of our assets listed insured currently. There are a number of properties that we don't insure and they are lower value. So we've got a number of dwellings that are under $500,000 and we don't have those on that schedule. And that's to try and keep the premiums down and in perspective. And they're also, you know, lower risk properties. We do, yeah, does that cover the question there? We do have under our policy as well, there is an insurance there for any asset that is uninsured building, so I should say specifically a uninsured building under the value of 250,000. So anything under 250,000, we wouldn't generally look at putting on that schedule either.
Thank you. So I think I'm assuming that you're doing everything that you can to optimize the premium prices as we go through this. Councillor Hopkins, you had a question?
Well, yeah. Yes, well, in fact, I've got a number. Just looking at going back, I've got questions about some of the recommendations you make on your page, whatever it is. But anyway, just going back to the very first one, it's a very minor matter perhaps, but I'm just curious to know why we're suddenly spending a modest amount of money for international travel insurance. That's my first question.
So we didn't have travel insurance, obviously, for the last 3 years when we had COVID period and no one was traveling, but there have been several staff that have had to attend work overseas. That insurance cover of $900 per annum includes the replacement of any technical equipment that's lost, stolen, broken, or otherwise when they are traveling as well. So it also covers for any health incidences while they're away. It's part of our responsibility to ensure that we have that cover there. And it's a lot cheaper. We looked at doing one individual policy for someone traveling overseas for 5 days. It was looking at $680, I think, if I recall, for that one person. Yet doing it as an annual premium for a no set amount of people traveling, it's $938. So.
I suppose that raises the question, how much international travel do we imagine we'll be taking or undertaking?
Mikuja?
Put it in perspective, I mean, if you were heading to the States and you end up spending a few hours in hospital over there, you know, that cost can be, you know, $15,000-$20,000. So, you know, having insurance is $900. We've probably spent that much talking about it.
Yeah,
it's pretty small peanuts.
I did say it was a small amount. Looking at the, but I accept the point you're making. Looking at the 7 most expensive assets, the two that jump out in terms of the biggest expense. Yes, Thames Street's gone up from 17 to 19, but the Opera House jumped 17,000 for insurance from 60 to 77, and the Aquatic Centre is up 5,000. The other question, so I mean, what can we do about those two? In addition to what you say down here as an option for 1 Thames Street to change the focus, but also with the airport, I presume the insurance increase is a consequence of the revaluation. And I don't suppose insurance can be tied to unfunded depreciation or valuation, or depreciation relative to valuation. But I mean, are we able to sort of extrapolate or take elements of the airport infrastructure out of the insurance policy and save money that way? I know there's a bunch of questions here, but I think they're quite important.
Thank you for that, Councillor Hopkins. So in that, yes, the premium on the Opera House has increased significantly. That's in line with the valuation increase. So the Opera House has increased $6 million on its valuation in relationship to the Aquatic Centre that's increased $3 million. So that's why there's that change variation and that increase. With regard to the airport assets, yes, we could take elements of that out. That is currently ensuring the whole encompassment of the airside assets. My recommendation is actually not to cover that asset at all because the risk to them I see is rather low. Those airport assets are not including the terminal and buildings. They're simply called including your fencing, your lights, your runways and things like that. If an incident happened that another aircraft landed on the runway, for example, and did damage, that would be their public liability insurance that's going to remediate that situation. At the moment, I've spoken to the property team to understand their view on whether this was something that we would need to insure it right now. And there is an airport strategy that's being produced. And because of the level of demand that we currently have at the airport, is there a need? And that's just me that's just an opportunity there, an option to consider of whether that should be the right way. But definitely another option with that would be to look at which assets that encompasses and taking some of them out and only insuring a component of that.
And just could we not do the same with the Opera House? And sorry, one question I forgot to ask. The fire in Palmerston, have we had to pay 50,000 as an excess on that? And where's that come from?
Yes. So first to the Opera House. No, you can't take out components of that because it's one building. So you don't have a cluster of assets that you're insuring there. You're looking at the structure of that building. So we couldn't sort of, I guess what you're saying is, could you say that you'd leave out the stage or something? But it's one building. It's valued on that structure and within. With regard to, sorry, was it the asset? SI assets, is it the? Oh, sorry, the fire. Yep, that we have had to pay. So where that's come from is the way that they've done that is the first, what we get, those invoices get sent directly to the loss adjuster. But the first $50,000 of those invoices we have to pay. So we've set that against the insurance code. Yes.
Thank you. I am conscious of time and the fact that we've got another couple of agenda items that we need to go through, but Mr. Hope, you had a comment?
Yeah, it really was about the valuations. These values are specifically for insurance purposes. So essentially we get the two valuations of the land and buildings, one for reporting purposes and the other for insurance purposes. What this is reflecting is essentially that's what it would take. Well, that's the valuer's assessment of what it would take to build a structure that would provide the same facility as the Opera House. So we're really relying on previous council decisions that the intent was that we would have sufficient funding that if there was a total loss, that we would be able to duplicate essentially the services delivered by that building. So that's why you're seeing the Opera House and the Aquatic Centre. I think these more specialised structures have the cost of replacing them has increased significantly, probably more than a lot of general real estate, and because they are so specialised. So that's what we based it on. That's the instructions to the valuers, and then we've ensured them consistent with previous council decision makers, really to be able to fully replace that service potential without any additional input from sort of council resource.
Mayor Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Neil. Yeah, I mean, it's right to give this scrutiny, but also we've got to be realistic. I mean, you know, it's very difficult to say, you know, did we have to come up with $50,000 for the fire in the flat in Palmerston, and where was that coming from when that was a decision previously? Let's save some money, let's have the excess at 50,000 rather than 5,000. Result, we've saved some money on some premiums, but we've got to find another $45,000 to actually do the repairs. And that's what a lot of this is about. The Opera House, you know, it is our policy that we will replace it if it's destroyed. Timaru is just spending $57 million on upgrading their Opera House, their theatre. These things are not cheap. And looking through some of those things, you know, the headquarters, basically under $17 million. You look at what other councils are doing, building new civic facilities and so on. It's not going to build a heck of a lot in comparison. So, you know, if something does happen, we need to know that we've actually got the money to do the job that needs to be done. And, you know, that's what Paul was saying, I think, this is a valuation to, you know, fill that gap, but it's not going to be a building that looks like this one or the Opera House. It's not going to look like the current Opera House. it's going to be a modern building which probably doesn't have too many bells and whistles. That's just the cost of it. And the premiums, you know, it looks to me that most of the premiums have gone up pretty much in straight line correlation with the increase in the values. So, yeah, I don't think we are paying over the odds with the increases. It'd be great if we didn't have any, but we do need to make sure that we cover ourselves and our community for when things do go wrong. And we need to be very aware that if we decrease the premium, decrease the cover, if we increase the premium, sorry, the excess, that's the word. You know, if something happens, then we've got to find that money somewhere, and you know, better to cover ourselves now up front.
Yeah, and
thank you.
Thank you. And I think this is no different to what all of us face at home when the AMI insurance bill comes through and everywhere else. It is just what it is. And I think, as I mentioned before, I expect and am observing that Mandy and the team are doing everything they can where they can to reduce premiums, and some of the recommendations that they make through this report are good examples of that. Councillor Holding.
Just a quick question on the new insurer covering MTB tracks. Does that fall under to our 324 kilometre one? And I was also had a quick question on you've got a claim back on the rec centre. Do we charge them back for that?
So on the mountain bike tracks, yes, previously they weren't insuring those runs. They are now. We've now got a new standard timber insurer who is covering those. So they're covering full ground. It was a fairly ridiculous decision by my mind that they decided not to cover mountain bike tracks, but they saw that as a risk from the Port Hills event. So they decided to opt out on that. And with the rec centre, but insurance for their haul is charged back to them. Yes.
Oh,
Sorry, Mr. Hope.
yeah, sorry, to clarify, this is a forest with a mountain bike track in it, not the mountain bike track itself, so.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any further questions? Okay, if not, so the purpose of the presentation today was for the Performance Audit and Risk Committee to recommend that the council confirms the insurance renewal with the premium changes as proposed. Do I have a mover for that?
One clarification, I'm not aware. I mean, we've got some suggested changes, options to consider, but we haven't signed off on any of those. The airport, the public toilets, or for that matter, Thames Street. So surely if we were going to vote on the premium changes as agreed, we'd have to actually agree to them, which we haven't done.
My apologies. I thought that was what the discussion was about, and we were concurring that we were comfortable with the recommended changes that were being presented.
I think a number of changes have been put to us, and I think there's been a response which will help staff form up what the final report to council will be. So I think there's been reasonable feedback on that. Just check with Mandy, you've had sufficient feedback. Yeah.
So just to clarify, this will be represented to council for sign off with those recommended changes explicitly laid out.
Yes.
And so you'll have the opportunity through council to sign off on those individually. So on that basis, do we have a Mayor Kircher, seconder, Councillor Halale? Thank you. I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Against? Okay, carried. Thank you, Mandy. We'll now move on to the next agenda item, which is agenda item 5.1. And I welcome Mr. Wells. Sorry, Paul, did you want to speak to this at all first?
So this is a report that we present to the Power Committee at meetings that occur between the presentation of quarterly financial reports. And what it does is it actually repeats quite a lot of the information that you've already had for the September quarter. But it looks at October year-to-date numbers, and also using those projects a very high level look at the end of the year, because we don't want there to be any surprises about income which hasn't been earned or costs that have been incurred over budget. You're already aware of the emergency works for roading, and it's now apparent to all of us, I'm sure, that the event centre is still at a very developmental stage, and we can't expect to earn or receive the level of income that we had anticipated in conjunction with that work. If you recall, the work was to be externally funded to a large extent, with council limiting its involvement to $10 million at the stage that we were preparing this budget. So it changes the year-end position quite dramatically, and we felt it appropriate to bring that to your attention. So I will gladly take questions, comments, or criticisms.
Thank you. And I open it up for any questions. Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, thanks for this, Ian. A couple of questions on your on our page 42. I presume the big jump in contractors relates to the emergency works, because it's nearly double what was budgeted. Although I think the emergency adds about $3 million to our costs. And the other question is, why is the Parks and Recreation expenditure so much lower than what was budgeted? Do we know?
So with regard to your question about contractors, yes, $3 million of unbudgeted expense is included in the 9.2 million. And the rest is simply timing of operational projects and other works. With regard to the Parks and Recreation capital, I presume you're speaking about. Parks and Recreation has, aside from the events centre, which is scheduled for later in the year anyway, a myriad of small projects relating to playgrounds, to walking tracks, and to toilets, among other things. And all I can suggest is that some of those projects have yet to get fully underway. Hopefully future reports will show an improving position.
I would have thought that there's an argument for some report to us, because they've spent a third of what was budgeted. Now, the budget would have been based on estimates of what we can do, will do, and who's available to do the work and so forth. So is this an issue that Paul's discussed before, the shortage of people available to do work, in which case I would have thought it's probably worth us being told.
I think we have actually raised a number of these projects, probably in other fora. Particularly, I'm thinking of the Tourism Infrastructure Fund projects that, yeah, there are a number of projects where we actually had to do additional work to qualify for the funding. We had to do some additional work in relation to the car park in the harbour area. Had to do, doing some extra work in relation to the walking track from Bushy Beach. Trying to remember the name across, because we significantly increased the scope of that project. And the last one I can remember is, it was certainly the progress on the Duntroon toilet was well reported. I can actually can report it is opened and functioning now, looking very good in the location, but that was certainly a lot slower than we expected, and that was purely to do with contractor availability. So I think we have reported a lot of these items to you, and it is something that we have recognised and will report further going forward.
Councillor McCone.
Is the capital expenditure on the three waters, is that recoverable?
No, we've finished all of the Crown funded tranche 1 work. We finished that by the deadline of 30th of June. So that would have all been in the prior year. This is all the work going forward, and that will be detailed how that is funded in the Three Waters workshop that's coming up in the next week or so.
Just to add to that, if if it's like, a lot of this will be loan funded. If it is, then that would go off to the new entity if the reform happens. Some of it will be funded by depreciation, so it's money we had sitting there. So I think that would be fair to say, Paul.
Thank you. Any additional questions? No. Okay, so the recommendation is that the Performance Audit and Risk Committee receives and notes this information, so no decisions are required. Can I put that motion to the meeting, please? All those in favor? You'll move. Second. Thank you.
Sorry, can you just take that?
Second was Councillor Blackler. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Now, I am remiss, so I'll just pop back to agenda item 3, please. I know that in 3.1 and 3 and 3.1, I asked whether there were any comments around the publicly excluded minutes, and everybody suggested that they were comfortable that we brought those forward, and I called for it to be put down as agenda item 3.2. However, I didn't formally call for a mover and a seconder. So can I please have somebody move that? Councillor Hopkins, a seconder. Councillor Halale. I'll put that motion to the meeting then, that item 3.2 is that the publicly excluded minutes are accepted and included in the public forum. All those in favour? Against? Thank you. I'll get it right next time. I now move on to the final agenda item in the meeting today, and that's agenda item 5.2, the Key Risk Register update. And again, I'll invite Paul to introduce the report.
Thank you. This is so a little different from the one you've seen in the past. And this is really due to a fresh set of eyes looking over what we'd reported in the past and how we'd assess some of the risks, and really redone in accordance with the revised risk management policy. So Ms. Lyons can talk about this a little bit, but then we're really happy to go through the items and discuss any of the items, but probably particularly the two that are still in red. Talking about the policy, so it's how far we go in mitigating some of these things, because probably to mitigate it further, there's probably a reasonable amount of expense or effort to do that. So it's really, are you happy? It's like, is this a level of residual risk you are comfortable with? It's probably the main question you need to ask yourself as we work through this. So over to you.
Thank you. Yes, so as Paul mentioned, this is a refreshed version of the strategic risk register that was previously provided. So some of the risks are new and some are sort of updated versions of the ones that were previously on that register. Two top risks are climate change and failure of a closely related entity. Climate change is a new addition, so there's nothing to refer back to. And failure of a closely related entity was previously on the register, but given that we've changed how we score impact and likelihood, there's not really a direct comparison we can make between the previous score and this one. So that's kind of been left out of this report, but going forward, we will want to make those comparisons and see where exposure is moving upwards or downwards. The very high scores for these two risks relate to essentially our inability in some ways to control the risk or mitigate it. For climate change, we're obviously at the start of getting some good work done in council. So we've appointed a climate change advisor. So that happened in recent weeks. So obviously it's very new. And as that role becomes embedded, we expect to see some additional controls being added into this register. And failure of a closely related entity is again a very difficult one for us to mitigate given the external factors at play with that one. So yeah, those are the two highest risks on the register. There are 6 risks with a rating of high. These are credit risk, failure by a borrowing entity, cyber risk, critical asset infrastructure failure or damage, iwi relationship development, 3 water transition, and major fraud perpetration. So a few of those were previously on the strategic risk register, and have been reviewed and updated. So again, a direct comparison can't necessarily be made. We have seen that a couple of those have increased in score since they were last reported in July, but that's mainly down to how we've changed the rating process. So rather than actually seeing an increase in risk exposure there. So that was cyber risk and the major fraud perpetration. Critical asset infrastructure failure or damage and iwi relationship development are both new additions. So they're coming with a complete fresh set of controls and a complete blank slate approach to how we've rated those. And those are the top 8 risks out of the register.
Thank you, Amelia. So I understand the purpose of the paper today was you've done some further work internally. You've recognised that there are both some new risks and some risks where their residual rating has changed somewhat, and that was significant enough that it's brought to the attention of the Performance Audit and Risk Committee. However, we're noting that the committee will receive training early next year around understanding risks in the risk management process, and we'll also have a full set of risks presented to us in March of next year. So out of today, you're looking for members of the committee to ask questions, provide feedback to you on these specific risks and the changes associated with them.
Absolutely, yes. So we will expect that this report will evolve and include more information as all the processes from the risk management policy become embedded. We start work on operational risk reporting and project risk reporting, and then operational risk event reporting. So yeah, this is sort of the first report from that revised key risk register. But going forward, we will expect this to include more information from different risk types, and we'll be able to direct the conversation into things that you may need to discuss and debate a bit more.
Excellent. Thank you. So on that basis, are there any questions surrounding this report and the highlighting of the risks that Amelia has identified today? Councillor Hopkins.
I do have one question that's probably perhaps directed best to Paul or Alex, but and our new policy analyst regarding these matters. I just wonder, I noticed that we've got climate change identified as risk very high. I would have thought that there is a possibility that a recent UN reclassification of the basis on which future temperature increases are calculated would actually have reduced the risk, because we had the UN had been using a formula, RCP 8.5, that all of our policy decisions and the Climate Change Commission and others have used as predicated all their conclusions upon, and the UN's wound that right back from 8.5 to 2.5. So basically the dire predictions about species extermination and sea level rise and so forth, predicated on the RCP 8.5 formula, are now deemed by the UN itself to be less likely than it was previously considered. And in the light of that, maybe it's a matter for the new climate change advisor to talk to us about, but perhaps that might warrant reclassifying the risk from very high to high. I don't know. I wonder if there's any comment.
So
I'll have a first crack. I mean, this is more about our need to respond to either so central government initiatives in terms of climate change, or where we're seeing a direct impact. So, more frequent rain events, which I think acknowledged, heavier rain events, which are having an impact, particularly on our roading network. Things like the landfill, the items with waste and being exposed on the foreshore. So it's more about, I think, those practical impacts on us that have a real financial impact, rather than, I think, a more theory-based discussion about whether a factor in the calculation of climate change. We are seeing reasonably significant costs flowing from those two items that we are needing to recognise and needing to accommodate. And that's essentially why this risk has, it's really a different perspective and bundling a couple, things that were probably dispersed across a number of areas, putting them into a single place and saying, here's the risk we actually need to mitigate for.
And I think just to add to that, it is really important, Councillor Hopkins, that we always remember that this is the Waitaki District Council's risk register, and the risk associated with climate change in the Waitaki region are significant and are real and remain high, because there really is bugger all we can do to reduce inherent to residual at this point in time.
Look, I agree, and I thought Paul's answer is basically saying there are very particular things related to us that we need to deal with, and the more general possibilities are less to do with our risk assessment. So I'm happy. I asked a question. I've got a good answer.
We'll get to the bottom of that UN equation. Are there any other questions or comments specific to this? Councillor Blackler.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. I just had a question about the political uncertainty section, and just wondering with respect to potential change in government next year and some of the possible promises around things such as three waters. Does the risk, do we actually think the risk may need to be higher in that space?
Amelia?
So this one currently, in discussion with ELT, we felt that it was a 3 impact and 3 likelihood. So we may see that increasing as we go through the next quarterly review and the ones after that as we get closer to general election. But currently we felt like our ability to respond is actually, we've got capacity to respond well at the moment. So this will see an increase if we feel actually our ability as a council to respond to political uncertainty and increased changes in approach, we become overwhelmed and actually we're unable to enact what we need to enact. So comfortable at the moment that we do have the capacity to respond.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I just meant to add another further point to my original question, and I was just wondering, obviously this register isn't comprehensive, it's just a quick oversight, that's correct. I just wanted to understand whether we encompass risk around our engagement with the public as part of this register, and what the possible inherent and resultant risk can be.
Generally, I think we'd see that come up more in perhaps project risk registers where we need to directly engage on a specific matter. It would probably be quite difficult to cover engagement with the public as a risk in this register that we could kind of rate appropriately across the board. But I will happily take that away and have the discussion with ELT and see if we can think of something.
Sorry, can you just, I suppose, clarify it a wee bit? I mean, do you mean direct interaction with the public, or more just risk over sort of general engagement?
So it was more around reputational risk, and I'd probably, just to kind of layer it out a little bit further in my mind, probably thinking perhaps in, say, a 3-tier approach. So, run-of-the-mill situations, engagement with the public might be, for obvious reasons, ranked very low risk, but things that are perhaps out of the ordinary, whether it be on just general engagement or the regulatory front, could present higher risks in terms of our relationship with the community.
Thank you. Again, conscious of time and I need to wrap this up pretty soon before the next meeting, but Councillor Halali.
Thank you. Just quickly, I wonder if there could be another section underneath that risk type. You know, you've got your strategic, your project, your operational type. But then for us as elected members, there's also the community representative hat that we wear. So we have the stewardship role, strategic role, community representative hat, and that's where the political area comes into play, and it's not necessarily covered within this. So my take from Councillor Blackler's perspective is how do we incorporate that within our risk assessments, our treatments and our controls to help mitigate? Not explicitly. Not explicitly, so.
No, it's not down as an explicit risk. These are the highlighted ones, and yes, you're absolutely right. There are many more risks in the register. But I think to Councillor Halali and Councillor Black's point, I don't know that we've explicitly teased that one out, and I think it's an action that's worth us taking away and investigating and potentially resurfacing.
I just thought, look, this is an update. Reputation is dealt with in the bigger risk document. We've also got a section consultation, significant policy that covers a lot of these things as well.
And if the action from this is to go away and look at it, and we've got it documented to a level that other councillors are happy with, then tick that box and move on. If not, then we could amend accordingly. McKercher.
Just to very quickly, just a suggestion, it may be considered to be covered under the political uncertainty, but the risk of future for local government reform not proceeding. I think, it is something that we're pinning our hopes and dreams on, and it could be quite major if it doesn't happen.
Yeah, and look, I think to your point and to Councillor Hopkins' point, some of those risks are potentially bundled up under a generic risk in the register, and we may look to tease those out a little bit further. But it's valuable feedback and something I think we should definitely take away and consider. Are there any further questions associated with this? Okay, if not, the purpose of the presentation of this today was that the PAR recommend that we receive and note the information. Could I have a mover for that, please? Councillor Cowles, and a seconder. Councillor Hopkins, thank you. Oh, I'll point it out. Councillor Black, move. Seconder, Councillor Hopkins. Thank you very much. I'll now say all those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you very much. And on the basis of the decision that we made under item 3.2, we no longer need section 6, 7, 8 or 9. So that takes me to agenda item 10, the meeting close. Unless there are any other questions or issues that anybody would like to highlight. Thank you. Then I'll now note that that's the end of the meeting and declare it closed at 2:38.
Merry Christmas to you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks.